Hi everyone, it's Dr. Leah Gibbons with the Regenerative Living Institute and Core Collaborative and Regen Living Ecosystem. And this is the Restoring and Regenerating Place Jam sessions. So today I wanted to dive into what are regenerative communities, since a lot of us have an orientation towards that, and also in regenerative development, really that's our ultimate goal, even if we're working on a smaller sub-piece of communities. You know, the overarching imperative is to create these regenerative communities. And so I'll explain why in more detail and what those look like also. And then we'll have time for discussion, a lot of time, about 30 minutes is the plan. Okay. So I'll share a few slides first, and then we'll go from there. Okay. So as usual, here's me and how you can contact me. And you can always come back and look at this later. Okay, we're talking about regenerative community development today. Okay, so the first thing is to understand what I mean when I say communities, because we all have a different conceptualization of what that is. So when I say it in the context of regenerative development, what I mean is a biogeocultural living system. Okay, and we've talked before about what are living systems. So just as a reminder, it's the human and the more than human components of life, as well as the geochemical components. So this is what creates that biogeocultural living system, right? This creates life, all these elements together. So when we're thinking about our role in communities and how to make them regenerative, we have to think very holistically about communities in this way, that they're the humans, you know, all the rest of life, and also those geochemical components like water, air, rocks. I'm not saying soil because soil is alive, right? That's a living component. So all those kinds of things, chemicals, nutrients, that sort of thing. And communities, from an ecological point of view, within a community, there are very strong flows and relationships between those components, and they all synergize to create the identity of that community. We might also call it the essence of the community. Then outside of the boundaries of that community, the flows, they're still happening, but they become much weaker. So from an ecological point of view, that's how we define a community. And it's very similar when we're thinking about human-dominated communities as well. We can think about our communities as having those very strong flows and relationships within the community. And then outside of it, they become weaker. And so when I am talking about communities, then they're very place-based. You can have communities that are purely social, of course, right, where we're communicating digitally, you know, online, remotely, and we have a global community. That's all wonderful. But in regenerative development, you know, everything is place-based. So we have relationships with the land and everything that lives on the land also. And we want to focus on communities and regenerative development because we want to have maximal beneficial impacts. And usually where people live and work and spend their time, you know, spend their waking and resting hours, you know, that's where they're going to have their biggest impact. That's where they're going to develop care and love for the place where they live, and they're going to be willing to put in that effort to make it regenerative. So this is where we can have that kind of maximum impact, and also where we can have impacts that will cascade upscale and downscale. And we've talked about this before too, how all life is organized and nested in networked communities. And so the impacts, even though within that community, everything, those relationships are very strong, we're still having impacts upscale outside of the community. And we have to be aware of those impacts. And that, of course, is one of the main principles of regenerative development, that we're working to improve the communities we're a part of, so those larger communities that we impact. So we can see that, you've seen this before if you've been in these sessions before, this idea and the reality that we exist in nested and networked ways, right? So as individuals, we're in communities, our communities are nested and networked in landscapes, and so on, all the way upscale. So again, this idea of working within communities so that we can have an impact on the landscape scale, the city scale, the bioregional scale, and so on, is really important. And also in community, that's where we as individuals can feel like we're contributing, what we have uniquely to bring to the world, so that we can find that fulfillment and purpose in our lives as well. Okay, you've also seen this. And so these are some of those elements, those biogeochemical and cultural elements of communities that we should think about when we're thinking about how to create a regenerative community. And really it's a co-creation process, right? Because it's all life and all of these elements working together to create the state of health of the community. So we're thinking about, of course, the organisms, right? As humans, usually the most dominant force in a community, and certainly in the kinds of communities we're talking about, we are very dominant with our abilities to manipulate and change the system. So we have to be very aware of that and take responsibility for that, and take responsibility for how we impact all of these other elements and how they're working together due to our influence to create health or not. So we're looking at things like, how are we using water and how are we affecting the flow of water? Because we want water to flow in as natural a way as possible. And we're looking at, how is water connected to food, for example? How are we using water to grow food? And are we using it in the best way possible to nourish more life? So this is always our overarching question. Are we acting in ways that are nourishing more life? Because that's regenerative. So you can see with this tool then that we can think about with the community as that scale right in the middle. This is magic scale where we're affecting downscale, right, to individuals, and we're affecting upscale, watersheds, landscapes, bioregions, and so on. And we're piecing together and we're learning to see how all of these elements that create this living system are coming together to create the state of health, and how we are impacting that and how we can impact to be more healthful, more thriving, more vital. And that's our role as agents of regenerative change. So we're doing this geographically and through time, as you can see on the arrow at the bottom there. Okay, so these are nice ideas. Let's get a little more into the weeds of what this looks like. So in regenerative communities, I've talked before about how, this is really about how humans, our consciousness and our thinking, because our thinking and our consciousness lead to our behaviors and our actions. So even as we're changing what we're doing, we're changing how we're thinking, our consciousness. So we're always working on these pieces at the same time, changing consciousness and changing actions. We're also working in social systems, right? Things like governance and economics and education, as well as more physical systems like the built environment and food systems and things like that that have a very kind of tangible component. So other parts of regenerative communities that it's important to understand. So speaking to this consciousness piece, right? We are partners with the rest of life. Can everyone make sure you're muted? Thank you. Okay, so we're shifting our consciousness, right, to understand that we're partners and we're in a co-creative dance with all of these other elements that we just talked about. And we're acting as conscious catalysts for all life to thrive, understanding that we are these powerful influences in systems. So we have to be very aware of what we're doing and how we're doing it and what we're thinking. We need to understand the places we inhabit very deeply and align ourselves with nature's and sources. You could say spirit, or whatever you believe in that's bigger than humans, life-giving principles. So this piece about really understanding your place deeply, it comes often with time, right? That it just takes time to be in a place and observe it and really understand how it works and what are these flows and patterns, right, that are in place that allow viability and health and thrivability. And how can we help those patterns and flows to manifest more and manifest more life? We also understand our community's unique character and purpose in the larger communities we're part of. Okay, so you remember that diagram from before about how everything's nested and networked. And so then we act in ways that increase thrivability in those larger communities. So perhaps our community has very rich agricultural soil, and we can grow a lot of food that can feed a lot of other communities. And maybe that's our role, to nourish a lot of the other communities in the area with the food that we grow. And as an extension, maybe we can nourish in other ways too. Maybe there are ways we can provide care for the other communities that we're a part of. Maybe we have some amazing people in healthcare fields or educators or things like that that can contribute to the larger community. So we always want to play a value-adding role in those larger communities we're part of, and we'll always have a unique way to do that. So even if you think about you as an individual, right, you are a very unique individual. There's no one else in the world like you. You have unique gifts and skills and talents to bring to the world and to give to your community. And it's the same, you know, the larger community that I'm talking about, these biogeocultural living systems. Okay, I'm going to read to you a little bit. I'll come back to this later because the other things I want to share with you don't go very well on slides. Plus, I like just having discussions with people often. So we can consider this part of our discussion. And if you want to have a comment, I'll definitely open up time for that, but you can also raise your hand or just kind of jump in. Okay. So you saw that little piece about source, right? Aligning with source's principles, spirit's principles. So one type, we could call it a subcategory of community, I call an eco-spiritual community. So in these kinds of communities, people are very much actively working on their spiritual development and their awareness and their embodiment of the idea that everything is one, right? Everything is part of one whole being, one whole organism. And so they're actively working on that. And I'm addressing this very intentionally because there is a growing, spiritual awakening that's happening in the world. And people who are experiencing this, they want to live in community and they want to live in right relationship with the rest of life. And they don't necessarily have the skills to be able to do that. And so this regenerative community idea is something that resonates with people in this group often. And it's a very natural alignment. So this is something that is attractive to people who are already kind of in this group, experiencing the spiritual growth and expansion. But also if you're living in a regenerative community, whatever terminology you use, you're always actively developing your relationship with the rest of life and with spirit. And I'm just going to use that word, but this word has roots even in quantum physics, right? So you can relate everything that I say that's about spirit or source to scientific principles. Because of course, now we know through quantum physics, right, the same things that spiritual teachings have been telling us for thousands of years, but we're using, scientific terminology and different ways of knowing about it and understanding it. And I want to share with you some interesting things about that. That nature, indigenous cultures and spiritual traditions tell us that the rest of life is aware, it's conscious, right? It has spirit. And so science is backing this up now too, right? That now we understand that other organisms like plants and mushrooms, animals, and of course, right? They can see, they can smell, they can feel, they communicate, they can mount defenses in a coordinated way. They remember, right? They can behave essentially, so respond very quickly in the moment. Plants sing to each other, sing, to people, so they're emitting vibrations and frequencies that are communication. forest ecosystems, it's well known that they have these kinds of features as well. And so even though, we might not see them as having the same kind of consciousness as humans, they do have consciousness. It's just in a different form, right, than humans have. So it's important to know this, because this really goes deep to the core of some of the values that we need to hold as regenerative practitioners and regenerative agents of change, right? That all life has value. All things have consciousness and are aware. And to be in right relationship with the rest of that consciousness is very important and provides, a foundation for how we live in community with all of these other elements. I also want to mention that probably most of you are familiar with ecovillages. And so ecovillages are wonderful, amazing communities. And sometimes they are regenerative, because we have to go back to those regenerative principles that I've talked about before. They're not always regenerative. Now, that doesn't mean they're not, moving on the spectrum from conventional to regenerative, because it is a spectrum. And of course, they're implementing a lot of regenerative design technologies, like capturing rainwater and reusing it, using permaculture principles, slowing, spreading, sinking water back into the earth so it can nourish the earth, creating more life where they live by using things like planting guilds, right? Species that help each other to grow and thrive and survive, producing food in ways that's regenerative. There are many, many aspects of ecovillages that implement regenerative design technologies, which, when used in this larger context of regenerative development, they can catalyze that change upscale, but they don't always. So we can look to ecovillages as good models for some of those design technologies. Definitely socially, they've pioneered a lot of fantastic ways to live regeneratively in community. But again, we want to follow these regenerative principles of catalyzing change upscale, creating mutualisms, working in wholes. They're working with change. They're those 7 principles I've laid out before. So ecovillages have tremendous potential to be regenerative, and they're definitely on the way. But I just don't want people to confuse ecovillages as the same as regenerative communities, because like I said, they're not always the same. Another point to mention here is that we can adapt existing communities to become regenerative. So we don't need to find some piece of land that no one has built anything on yet and think we need to go out in the middle of nowhere to create a regenerative community. We can create them right where we live right now. There are ways to start shifting our activities and the way we live, our infrastructure, right where we live. So we can create these communities at scales that make sense, where we are. Okay, I'll read to you some of the regenerative design technologies that can support regenerative communities, so you have a more kind of grounded sense of what this can look like. Okay, so our homes and other structures can be built out of local and renewable materials. So things like earth, hay, and timber. Sometimes we can get timber on site if it has to be, certain structural integrity to use it for structural purposes. We can use it for all kinds of other purposes as well. So this is important, to try to get materials as locally as possible and have them come from the earth. And there are other reasons for that as well, right? We want to think about human health. So often our built environment is full of toxins because we've got materials that are just, loaded with chemicals that are spitting them out at us and making us sick. So part of regenerative community development is making sure that the buildings are healthy as well, right? Healthy for humans and healthy for the rest of life. So you can do that with natural and local materials. Another part of that is to the greatest degree possible, we want the people living in the community or in the larger community to be the ones designing and building these structures, of course, with guidance from experts in this field. But the more people are involved in this process, the more ownership they have, right? And I don't mean necessarily, like tangible ownership, but the feeling of ownership, of stewardship, like they want to take care of this because they created it, right? They co-created it with their community members. And it's also part of building this regenerative capacity, that they learn these skills, they learn how to think about the systems that they're living in as these living systems that they need to care for. So this is part of that process, that they are involved in co-creating the community. Things like on-site rainwater capture, use and reuse, of course. And when humans are done using it, you can use the water for things like watering food crops, or you can let it enter back into nature in ways that are safe. If it's black water, for example, you can use things like, constructed wetlands that will essentially purify the water before allowing it to go back into things like creeks or wetlands. Using things like regenerative agriculture and permaculture and agroecology, which I think most people are familiar with now. That's a great thing. And we want to think about how those practices are part of bigger regenerative food systems. So food systems entail everything from how we transport the food, how we are exchanging the food with people who are buying it, education for those consumers. We can allow the consumers, to come onto the land and experience growing the food, being part of that process. There are many ways to create regenerative food systems, and communities can be a great way to catalyze those food systems in bioregions. Of course, we want to get most of our energy from the sun. And I think we should be calling this primary energy, right? Because our primary energy source is the sun. So every way we can get energy from the sun first, and using smart design, right? So we're designing our structures so they don't necessarily need a lot of heat or air conditioning. There are fantastic ways to design buildings so you don't really have to heat or cool them that much, and you can use very low amounts of energy. Also, things like you can think about how you're cooking your food, how you're doing laundry, things like that. So those are all like behavioral and design elements. But then as far as when we do need to use energy, where we get it from, how the technologies we're using for that are really important. So we want to use primary energy from the sun as much as possible. Of course, we want to restore and regenerate any ecological areas that are part of our community that we're not going to be building on. So we definitely want to put aside as much land as possible to mostly be for nature. Of course, humans will enjoy it as well, but nature needs a lot of space for humans to not occupy it, right, and not use it intensely. So we want to give that back to nature. We definitely want community economies that have their own local currency. And as we think about economies, right, economies are really just exchange and trade. So we can think in economic terms about everything that's being traded and exchanged. So not just goods and services, but those things I talked about before, like water, food, nutrients, and so on. So how are those things flowing and being exchanged and traded? Right, we want our governance to be deeply participatory. We want everyone's voice heard, everyone involved. We want everyone to have power. And this can be a tricky one because a lot of times not everyone wants to be that deeply involved in governance, and that's fine. And sometimes there are people who are more excited about governance and they want to play more of a role. And that's all fine too. We just need to make sure we have structures and systems in place that don't lead to the accumulation of power with certain people, right, who become egotistical and greedy and abuse the power, right? So this can all be avoided with proper governance structures. We want our community members to be actively working on their own personal growth, right? Because the number one reason intentional communities fail is because of personal conflicts. And because we have a hard time growing, right? We have a hard time receiving feedback and changing. And again, there are structures and programs and ways to make this easier for people. But knowing that it's a crucial element of community is very important, so it can be there from the beginning. Okay. I think I'll leave it at that for sort of a brief description of some of the things you might see in a regenerative community. And again, think about how communities are working across scale, right, to benefit the communities that they're a part of. So we're almost at the 30-minute mark, and so I'll just open it up. And what I want to hear from you about is, you could comment on anything you heard that was exciting, that you particularly like, anything that you feel is particularly powerful. I would also love to hear about your experience in intentional, sustainable, regenerative communities, and what have been some of the most wonderful things you've experienced in community and some of the most challenging things. So whoever would like to share can just go right ahead.
I'm happy to. I think one of the most exciting things that you said was the more that people are involved in co-creation and the more that they take ownership, and ownership meaning, in this case, caring for and maintaining those co-creations. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, thank you. And that really is key when you're doing regenerative projects of any type. For them to be successful, you really need to have that level of involvement and care. Anyone else?
Yeah, hi everyone. I think I found this web group from the Seeds network, so I guess I'll just give a bit of a background. There's another member on that I just met, and I invited him to the group Economies, so I'll just introduce him quickly as well. We're busy actually in the process. Like you said, there's a great awakening happening around the world. We're busy building a couple of eco-villages, and we're also running a couple of a big piece of land, a conservancy here in South Africa. And Bongani is new to the things, so I hope he's learning a lot from it. I guess the takeaway or the thing that excited me most, that was that exchange, that trade that you're happening. My most valuable thing is sort of the knowledge that's being exchanged. You know, like you're sharing many of these things with the group. What are they taking away from it? How are they going to be implementing to their lives? And that's like the most value that I'm taking away from it currently at this moment. And I look forward to great regenerative movements. And this, you know, just in this past week, there's been some amazing things happening all over the world. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. This has been an interesting week, this past week.
I had a general question. So, you know, there are like hundreds of eco-villages out in the world, or at least hundreds of them calling themselves eco-villages, and they all individually kind of assume that they're being regenerative. And but there isn't any body any institute or organization that's going around saying, yes, you really are regenerative, or maybe you're not, or you're kind of here and there. What have you seen in terms of like, you know, eco-villages around the world that generally tend to make them less regenerative than they feel they are?
That's a good question. And when they started, so you probably know about the Global Eco-Village Network. And when they started using this word regenerative to describe eco-villages, that got my attention. And I thought, okay, what do they think regenerative is? And it's more like regenerative design is really what they mean. So when we think about regeneration in the way that I've conceptualized it with the principles and characteristics, like I said, they don't all meet those characteristics, and that's okay, you know, as long as they're progressing. But right now, a lot of them don't even know what to progress towards. So that's one reason I created this regenerative community development framework, so that we do have some standards to aim for. And that's not to say that these won't change in the future, right? Because this is a co-created thing we're doing all together. And as we learn more about nature's principles and life's principles and how we think about them, you know, it necessarily will change. But for now, I think it's a pretty good set of principles and characteristics to aim for. So the things that would make an eco-village like less regenerative are if they're very insular, and a lot of them are, right? They do have aims to catalyze and usually educate or be a model for what other communities can do, but being a model is not necessarily regenerative. So like I explained before, like when you are a community that exists within other communities, you will see the needs within that larger community and how your community can meet a particular need or some of those needs. And in nature, you can see this principle working when you see that every organism, every element plays a value-adding role. In other words, they contribute to the health and the vitality of the larger system they're part of. So regenerative communities must do that, right? There must be a way for them to do that. And they just need to find it. And it's usually not that hard. If you follow like the process that I've created, you can find it actually very easily. So a lot of them don't do that. You know, in a lot of other areas, they're doing pretty well. Like I said, they have been experimenting with a lot of different regenerative design technologies for a very long time. And I think in particular, some of the social aspects, you know, they've been working on very well, because as far as ecological design goes and regenerative design, you know, we've been doing that for hundreds of years, right? Like this goes way back to the 1800s, and it's just been kind of evolving and progressing since then. But socially, you know, we've been through a lot of ups and downs, and we're really entering a time now where people are much more aware of our social systems, issues of power and equity, and you know, how we're communicating and how we're recognizing everyone's inherent gifts that they bring to the world, and how to allow people to express those and give those, you know, to the world and to their communities. So I think that's a very another important piece, because a lot of times in communities or any kind of human organization, we tend to want to pigeonhole people or put them in specific roles that maybe they're not well suited for. And so one of these principles of regenerative development that applies uniquely to people would be to give people or create systems or conditions that allow people to explore and find out, you know, what am I here to do? Like what am I really good at, and what do I love doing, and how can I gift that to my community to make the community healthier, more vital, and better. And so really allowing that kind of space and being patient with people as they go through this process and supporting them, and still creating boundaries, right? And that's like saying it's not okay for you to do that in a way that would hurt other people or in a way that would hurt the community. And I think that's very important. I think we're still experimenting with that quite a bit, even in eco-villages. The other piece I would say is, you know, the whole world is struggling with this. Like, how do we create these local economies? And of course, Seeds is working on this quite a bit, and so are many other groups. Like, how do we create economies that can be very local and can keep our flows and resources as local as possible, while still understanding that they do need to go outside of the community and resources from outside need to come in. There needs to be that cross-scale flow. But within the community, the flow needs to be stronger of those economic resources. So we're still playing with that a lot, and what that looks like and how to make that healthy, not just so that people's needs are met, but so they can have a really thriving, fulfilling life. You know, like people, we want extra income to do things like travel or, maybe we have some special healthcare needs that need more money, or maybe we want to take educational programs that are, require some income. There are all kinds of reasons to want to have income above and beyond just what we would consider our basic needs. So that's another area that I think we're all experimenting with right now. Thank you. Anyone else?
I just wanted to give one example of the oldest community, and maybe the most prolific is the mushrooms and the mycelium. Whilst you've been explaining this, it's what sort of came to my mind that, it's such an amazing regenerative community where it has so many, what's the word I should use? Not thriving, but just abundance in it. If you take just one mushroom that's releasing thousands of spores and creating this whole like further network, but at the same time it's degrading and turning things into compost, and just has so many beneficial uses to it. So I think that's what my mind is coming to is this amazing abundance of resources that we can actually pull from, and maybe not to limit ourselves too much to the thing. I just wanted to use the mycelium as an example. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic example for all the reasons you said. And also, the mycelium they're a communication network, like plants, trees, microorganisms in the soil, they all communicate through mycelium. So yeah, mycelium are fantastic servants in our communities.
Yeah, just quickly, they also they can be so beneficial to our planet or humans as a whole, where we can build our houses out of them, we can make our plastics out of them, we can use them as food, we can use them as medicine. So, that's also why I kind of defined it as a regenerative, giving it the name regenerative. That's my understanding of regenerative.
Yeah, and they even have the ability to consume and transform toxic waste, like oil spills and even old coal mining sites, right? They are amazing organisms. So if we can think that way, like how do we think like mushrooms and mycelium? How do we think like trees? Just look at nature for our guide, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to live in alignment with nature's principles.
As a follow-up, being a lot of ecovillages are indeed isolated, and they're not necessarily connected like a mycelium network. Would you be able to show a screenshot of the principles and see where in those principles that is being addressed, so you can actually point out how that actually works in the standards?
Yes. Okay. Here are the principles. Okay, so regenerative living systems always exhibit these principles. Okay, so if we look at nature without humans, right, this is how we can discern what is regenerative and what's not. And, humans with our brains and our egos and all this, we can't get out of these principles, but what we can do is we can sort of pretend to ignore them or delay processes that happen in nature and cause the system to become unhealthy for a time, but it will always, come back to health eventually. And so that's what we're seeing now with all the sustainability challenges that are in the world, is the earth essentially going through a process to come back to a healthy state. So these principles, main principles, are very simple to remember because there are only three: wholeness, change, and relationships, right? Everything exists as wholes. And I have also talked about this concept of holons, holarchy, which is a mix well, I can show that in just a second. So everything exists in wholes, and there are, like I said, nested and networked wholes. So they're connected. So everything is functioning in wholes, not in fragments, but humans tend to fragment things. We tend, and we have to, because our brains, like, it is impossible for us to conceptualize the complexity of life, like literally impossible. So what we can do is we can identify some of the main elements that are really organizing a system, and we can work with those elements to help it be healthier. So that's the good news, that we don't have to understand all of the complexity of life, but we do need to understand certain things about it. So some of these principles and characteristics get into that. And this comes to our thinking, right? Our thinking needs to be as holistic as possible. Things are always changing, right? Like, that is one of the only things we can ever count on in life, that there's constant change. So when we try to stop change, that's when we run into problems. Because when you stop change and you stop flow, I often use this word flow, then a system stagnates and it dies. Right? Everything has to be constantly moving, flowing, changing, exchanging. That's what creates life. And that's the third principle, relationships. Right? That everything is connected, everything is in relationship, everything only exists because it's in relationship. So really, we're asking, how do we make those relationships healthy, mutually beneficial? So let's go back to change. Okay, change is manifesting potential, right? That's really its purpose in a living system. And we can go into quantum physics here, or spirituality, where we can see that there's an explicate order that's expressed. That's what we see, like the reality we experience and see. And then there's an implicate order that's kind of like the energetic blueprint that's about to be manifest. And so a lot of this process of regenerative development is sort of tapping into that implicate order that's about to be manifest or wants to manifest. So that's a whole nother deep conversation we'll save for another time. Another part of change is that regenerative capacities are increasing. So these are capacities to increase continually in health, well-being, and vitality. And these get into the characteristics of the regenerative living systems, which I can show next. And then that third main meta principle of relationships, right? That everything only exists because of relationship. And I'll throw in another quantum physics fact here for you, because I just love how, our knowledge in that field has grown so much recently and explains so much. So part of recent quantum physics findings are that matter manifests out of a difference in vibration or frequency. So it's this difference in frequency and that relationship that creates matter, right? So everything only exists because of relationship. And in regenerative living systems, like I mentioned before, everything adds value to the systems it's a part of. And value means health, vitality, well-being. So we're adding value to the systems we're part of, to those larger systems we're part of, so the whole can be healthier. And then that's the role of that component of the system. It's to create the health of the whole system as a co-created activity. And one way to do this is mutualisms and guilds. And so if you're trained in permaculture or ecology, of course, you know what this means, this word guild. It's the set of reciprocal relationships within the elements of a system, and they're not necessarily one-to-one. So it's a group that's contributing, in rather indirect networked kinds of ways that increase the health of the whole, while you do increase your own health as well. Because of the flow of the relationships and the elements in the system, the flow will come back to you and will help you be healthier as well. And the final sub-principle is the nodal leverage points. So I told you that even though we're working in complex living systems that we can't possibly understand completely, we can identify places in the system where many flows converge. And those convergence points are the nodal leverage points. So that's where if we make a shift at that point, we can shift a lot of things that are happening in the system, and we can shift the health of the whole system. And so being trained and skilled in living systems perceiving can help you find these nodal leverage points. But a lot of times it's not really that hard. A lot of times water is a nodal leverage point, food. Those are really the two main ones, but it totally depends on your culture and your climate, where you're living. And if you want, I can go into the characteristics if you want me to. Otherwise, I would love to hear more from other people, but let me know.
You just touch on them quickly.
Okay. All right, so here are the characteristics of regenerative living systems. So they must have these characteristics to be regenerative as well. And I grouped them just so they're easier to work with into traits, dynamic networks, structure, and uniquely human qualities. Right, so systems have to be diverse to be regenerative. Now, too much diversity isn't good and too little isn't good. So there's this like magic spot of diversity. And we just have to sort of play with that a little bit to find out what is that spot. And again, it's going to change, right? Because living systems are always changing. This is part of those human qualities at the bottom of reflection, holistic thinking and acting, long-term thinking, collaboration and responsibility that we have to like constantly be aware of in relationship with, and watching the system we're part of to gauge its health. And we can use things like this, these characteristics, and I've also created some things we can use to evaluate living systems for their degree of regeneration. So we can use things like that to gauge the health of the system. And some of it is kind of intuitive as well. People don't like to hear that because they want to have like concrete things they can measure. And in the beginning, when you're learning how to relate to your system and intuit its level of health, that's very helpful. And it's also very helpful for a variety of other reasons. But the things we measure should be qualitative as well as quantitative. And the community itself should be creating those measurements, like with a guide, with somebody who's skilled in doing this. But then the community will co-create those with the guide and will be collecting the data, themselves. And this is part of developing their consciousness so that they are deeply in relationship with their place and aware of its state of health and how it's changing and how it's evolving and growing. So let's go back up to the traits. Okay, multifunctionality. So the mushroom example, is a beautiful example of multifunctionality, where one thing should have many purposes, right? And we have tended in our human history recently to create things and engineer things that have one purpose. And when you do that, the system becomes very vulnerable, right? And we don't want vulnerability. We want resilience, adaptability, flexibility. So multifunctionality is really important. You could think of it also like, well, like the way I described using water, multiple times, that's a multifunctionality of water. You don't want to use it like just to flush your toilet. How stupid is that? Like there's so many ways you can use water productively and then clean it so it can go back into the system and nourish the system rather than just a single use. Now redundancy goes along with this as well, that multiple functions, or let me put it the other way, one function is fulfilled in multiple ways by multiple things. And the reason for that is if any one of those fails, you have backups basically. So think about, again, our mycelium network. Like if one mushroom dies, or even several, like it's okay because there's redundancy in the system. There are other mushrooms, there's more mycelium, right? It will fill back in that space. So it's not to say that those individual elements don't have value. They absolutely do. But the redundancy in the system allows it to continue to evolve and grow and thrive, even if a single element, something happens to it and it changes or it dies or what have you. And that's part of adaptability as well. So this goes back to some of those design elements I was talking about. And let's think about our buildings, right? Like we have tended to design buildings to be very single use, very, very inefficient, toxic, and not at all adaptable. We're starting to learn that especially for homes, right? We need to design them to be adaptable so we can age in place, right? This is a not super new term, but in a lot of parts of the world, a new term. To age in place, we need to have our homes be adaptable. We need to be able to reconfigure them easily, you know, for our needs as we change in our different life stages. Let's see. So I think I'll stop talking now, unless you have any questions about specific parts, elements of these characteristics, but you can kind of just read them for yourself. But for now, if you have questions about any specific elements, let me know and I'll explain it.
Olivia has her hand raised.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Olivia.
Thank you. So I think the question I want to ask has to do with the concept of relationships, which I know you said was why everything exists is because it's in relationship. And I think you also mentioned something about communities maybe putting off or trying to ignore certain principles, and eventually the system itself or nature itself then guides that community or that system into a certain level of chaos, and then it resolves, and then there's a moving forward. What is that? Did I hear that right?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
Beautiful.
And I talked about this last time because you were on that call when we talked about panarchy and those cycles. Remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I also know what you say about the number one reason communities fail is because of personal conflict. And that's definitely been something that I've seen happen, and personally is the fact that within the community there are personal tensions, and that affects the entire community. And one of the things that I think I noticed is that the reason for those personal conflicts is a rigidity, but also within, but also a need to regenerate the system within the single person. So each individually need to regenerate something about their own inner workings. And I know you also talked about the idea of like nudging. So there are people that can kind of like help nudge through the regenerative process. And I wonder what the best way is to help nudge each individual of a conflict to regenerate their inner world versus focusing so much on the outer world to try and change the circumstance.
Wonderful question. Thank you for asking that. I don't know what's been going on this last week, but so many people have been asking me similar questions. So something's happening that we are being told to look at this collectively, right? Like how we relate to one another. And I don't want to get too deep into spirituality here, so I'll just maybe rely on psychology, right? So we all have these egos, right? These like personality selves that we present to the world, but that's one aspect of us, but it's not our real self, our complete self. So often in conflicts, what happens is, you know, those egos are just like so strong. And like you're saying, like it's rigidity, right? People don't want to budge out of their role that they have created their ego to be in. And from a like bigger spiritual perspective, it's quite silly, isn't it? That we want to hang on to those egos. But you know, there does take a level of awareness that this is happening, right? That we all have these egos that we come with, and to be aware of them when we're in conflicts, like how much of this conflict is due to ego, how much is like an intuition that's coming to me that I really feel like this is the right choice, how much of this is my experience and knowledge that I'm bringing to this that I feel like it's the right choice. How much of this is like my past experience in my life and my trauma that's coming up to make me act this way. And there are all kinds of elements that are involved in conflict. And so, it does take a lot of work to be aware of all this, because most people in this culture, we're never taught this. We don't talk about it. We don't practice it. We mostly try to ignore it. And if the conflict comes up, either some people will ignore it or succumb to the more dominant person in the dynamic, right? And that's kind of how it's been. So there does, I think in regenerative communities, need to be a lot of work around these issues and a ton of awareness. And I've heard in some of the more successful, like ecovillages and intentional communities, they have this practice that if 10 people give them similar feedback about an issue they need to work on, they know it's real, right? It's something they definitely need to work on for the good of the community and to make themselves a better person. So I like that rule because, a lot of times you can't really trust what one person tells you about how you're behaving, but if 10 people tell you, it's probably right. And so being able to present that kind of feedback to people in a loving way, like understanding that we're all in our own phase of personal development. We're all going through these cycles, and I don't know what someone else is dealing with. I don't know where they are in their personal cycle. All I can do is offer loving feedback and support for them through those cycles. And if we kind of all come with that mentality, like we're here in relationship with others, we're all on our own personal journey, even as we're on a journey together, and approach each other with love, it really diffuses a lot of conflicts. And then the second point about conflicts, which we often miss, is that when we have a conflict, sometimes it's because something new, is trying to emerge. So coming at it from that point of view as well, that, there's something totally new here that can happen, that can be born. That's another way of looking at conflict. Like maybe you don't even have to think about anybody changing or being right and wrong. Maybe you can think about it like there's an opportunity for everyone to grow. There's an opportunity for something new to happen and emerge, something better than existed before. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that was incredible, very inspiring. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I guess too, for smaller communities, do you think like there's a ratio that would make sense instead of the 10 people? Like is 10 people a certain fraction of like?
You could ask, like if it's something people have come to you with and it's a small community and you want to know if this is a real thing you need to work on, you could ask people you trust who will give you an honest answer and who love you enough to tell you the truth. Because that's another aspect in our culture, right? Sometimes we don't tell people the truth about what's happening because we don't want to hurt their feelings or, there are other reasons. But to really love someone is to be able to tell them truths like that, even though it's your perspective, right? It's like your personal truth reflecting on this dynamic you both have, but you can ask people for their opinions.
I think Olivia was asking a practical question of like, if it's 1,000 people, maybe you need 50, or if it's 10 people, maybe you need 3. But like, do you have like a general rule of?
No, because I think in big communities, the 10-person rule is fine. In small communities, like if you have less than 10 people, maybe it only takes 2 or 3, maybe just 1, like I think it just totally depends on the group and what's happening.
Yeah, Poyam had his hand raised for a while.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Poyam?
Sorry. Yes. Thanks. This is an interesting discussion. I missed the presentation earlier, so I'm a little disappointed at that. But I do have some questions. I have 2 questions. So the first one is a little simpler, but I'll ask them both because they're kind of related. So the first one is around the I forget what you called the second slide with the traits and the not the principles, but the other
Characteristics?
the characteristics. Yeah, thank you. So that question is around how do we measure those things? You know, some of them it's pretty obvious, like biodiversity or diversity you can measure. You know, redundancy you can measure, multifunctionality you can measure, but there are some of these things that seem difficult to quantify. So that's the first question, and then the reason, part of why I'm asking this is related to the second question. So I'm developing a bioregional network for kind of a large bioregion. So I guess medium size, I don't know. And my inclination in the beginning was to say I'm developing a regenerative network. Now I toned that language down because mostly because of marketing issues. There's so many people that don't even understand what that means. But that's my second question, is sort of how to approach that in terms of, you know, I want the network to be regenerative. That's my aim. And I'm working, so going back to that first slide, I'm working on those principles. You know, I'm trying to solve, you know, incorporate those principles in the way the network is run, the way that it's structured, and what it offers. There are pieces missing, right? I'm still trying to get it to work in the way that that I would like, I guess. And so the first question is like, okay, I'd like to be able to measure some of these things for the network itself, to say, oh, like how healthy is the network itself? And then secondly, the second question is more about talking about the network, you know, and this is obviously something you can't exactly answer, but, you know, in terms of, so one of the things that we highlight is like regenerative farms in the network, or even if they're not regenerative, we want to know if they are leaving wildlife buffers or if they are reducing pesticide use. We'd like to know that and tell people. Or, you know, or let's say there's a company and they, you know, just manufacture something and they're reducing energy use, or or even they're using profits from their company to help the homeless situation in their area. It has nothing to do with their business model, but they're just giving back to their community. We want to let people know about that kind of thing. Let them know that this company is contributing to the region in some kind of positive way. Now, that's not necessarily regenerative, but it's almost like we're trying to take our steps there. We're trying to get there by highlighting some of this stuff. And then obviously a big part of it is educating people about all this stuff. So I don't know if that was too much, but if you want me to sort of make the question more concise, I can.
No, we can do this. Okay, so for the characteristics, you're right. A lot of this cannot be measured in a way that people are comfortable with in our culture. And a lot of this is locally specific, right? So like
Right.
Diversity, okay. You know, you would have to have, you know, I use the word expert just to say someone who is trained in a field, right? And you can trust their knowledge and judgment. So maybe an ecologist, right, who is very familiar with your area, come and help you decide like what's an appropriate level of diversity for it to be regenerative.
Right.
And so, you know, you can quantify that one in a sense. There's also quality to diversity also, though. So being able to have qualitative measures with your quantitative measures is important. And you can include things, like I mentioned, intuition. You can include that in qualitative measures because you can ask people how they feel about certain things. What have they noticed? You know, this is data that in social science and you know, just qualitative data in general, which can be used in other kinds of science as well. You know, as long as you are thoughtful about how you're collecting it and what you're collecting, it can be very informative. It can be far more informative actually than quantitative data. It's usually more difficult to gather and to analyze, but you can still do it. And I would say for regeneration, it's actually way more important in a lot of areas.
Yeah, I mean, the whole world of sense making is about this whole thing. So the whole sense making field is about what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Because like, let me try to pick one. Okay, let's just pick interdependence, because that's a principle in nature, but it's also like a human social principle and characteristic. Right, so to gauge the interdependence of the people in your community, you could do that quantitatively for sure. Like you can look at what are the flows of specific tangible items and services that you want to track to see like to what degree are people creating a healthy interdependence. Okay, please understand this is not codependence, right? Interdependence is when we are lifting each other up because of our relationships. So you can track that quantitatively. It could also be a qualitative assessment. So you could just ask people, how do you feel about your relationships with others in the community as far as interdependence, assuming they know what that means and they're educated about it and they have a correct view about what that means. And you can assess that for the natural, the non-human parts of the system as well. And in that sense, that's more about there are these things called network analyses in science that you can do that help you understand relationships and their strength and their flows and all these things. And so like that kind of analysis, it's often, beyond what a community is going to have the capacity to do, right? Like I'm not going to expect any community to buy network analysis software and be running network analyses, but I do think they can develop just the capacities on their own to see it, right? To like have a sense for it. And they can even, collect data and keep it in very simple software programs that everyone has access to kind of gauge the degree of interdependence that we're seeing in the human world and in the more than human world. So I hope that was an illustrative example for how all these different aspects of gauging the health of a system and its degree of regeneration can happen.
Yeah, it was. Thank you.
Okay, and then the other part was how do you, basically the question as I understand it is how do you talk to people about this? Is that fair?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
It's like I have described what is regeneration. I'm going to continue to do that, but and what is regenerative, but at first I was trying to talk about sort of the network of people that I'm the community that I'm working with, and talk about it as a regenerative community, but not all of the actors or people within the community are necessarily regenerative, but I don't want that to be something exclusive, but I still want people to understand what we're building.
Okay. Yeah, so the way I very simply explain regeneration, like often people will ask, what do you do for a living? And I'll say, well, I do regenerative developments. And no one knows what that means, so I have to explain it. And I say, well, you're familiar with sustainability. Okay, usually the answer is yes. I'm shocked when it's no, so it's usually yes. And I say, well, regeneration goes beyond sustainability to create the healthiest, most thriving communities and living systems possible. And even if they don't know what that really means, they're intrigued. Like they want to know more. They're like, oh, that sounds really great. Like, what does that mean? How do you do it? So I think that's a very simple way just to explain the very basic core premise of what it is.
Right.
And then when people want to know more, what that takes is understanding where they're coming from and their perspectives, their background, to really be a bridge, right? So bridge from where they are and their understandings of the world, their perspectives on the world, to what is regeneration. Because you want to talk to different audiences in different ways. You want to use their language, the language they understand, and be able to help them translate into regenerative terms.
Right.
So it's not so easy, but
No.
Yeah, it's part of the regenerative communication too, to be quite honest.
Mhm.
We have to meet people where they are and then help them bridge to a new way of being.
Right. Well, thank you. That's very valuable.
Welcome.
I'll put my I'll put a link to my network in the chat.
Okay, that'd be great. So we're almost done. Let me show you, I want to show you one other thing before we go. Find this. Okay, I want to let you know, I've told you before about the Regenerative Community Development Certification and the Regenerative Leadership Program, which is also certification. And I've decided to offer shorter courses, so like introductory courses, and then for the leadership program, a short course, as well as different levels. So hopefully, I'll have these launched and everything planned out by the end of next week. So I want to let you know that, I think a lot of people right now are having difficulty committing to anything that's longer in duration or costs a little bit more with, the state of our global economic system being what it is. So offering shorter and less expensive courses for people, want to do that. So check these websites for when those are going to be launched, hopefully again, the end of next week. And the other thing I should mention is the Regenerative Living Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit. So if you feel moved to donate or volunteer, we would be very grateful. So feel free to reach out. There's also a donate link on the website. And beyond that, thank you all very much. And we're always looking for collaborations as well. So feel free to reach out. All right, thank you all very much. And as always, if there are topics in particular you want to hear about, feel free to email me and we can address those in future jam sessions. I also want in future jam sessions to make space to have sort of like guests who would like to share about their project or maybe have an expertise in a particular subfield of regenerative development and design. So if that's of interest to you, please let me know.
And all the meeting recordings are on the Regenerative Living Institute YouTube. If you just do a search for Regenerative Living Institute, all the past meetups are recorded and posted there.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Again.
Thank you. See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.